In the summer of 1881, a decree was issued from Constantinople that would destroy the savings of millions. The Ottoman Empire, once the terror of Europe, the conqueror of Constantinople, the guardian of the holiest sites in Islam, had officially declared itself bankrupt. The treasury was empty. The debts were unpayable. And a committee of European bankers was about to seize control of the empire's finances in a humiliation unprecedented in 600 years of Ottoman history. On that day, wealthy merchants watched their fortunes evaporate like morning mist under a harsh sun. Landowners saw their property values collapse to fractions of what they had been worth just months before. Government officials who had been paid an increasingly worthless currency found that their savings could no longer buy bread for their families. Panic spread through the bazaars of Istanbul, through the trading houses of Smyrna, through the banking quarters of Thessaloniki. Families who had built wealth over generations, who had considered themselves secure against any misfortune, saw it all vanish in weeks. But not all of them. In the chaos of that financial apocalypse, 3 families not only survived, they emerged wealthier than before. Their names have been largely forgotten by history, overlooked in favor of sultans and generals, but their strategies for preserving wealth through economic collapse contain lessons so powerful, so practical, that they remain relevant today, perhaps more relevant than ever. This is the story of how they did it, and what their survival can teach us about protecting what we've built when the world falls apart around us. To understand what these families did right, we must first understand what everyone else did wrong. In the decades before the 1881 collapse, the Ottoman economy had seemed, to most observers, fundamentally sound. Yes, there were debts to European banks, but empires always had debts, and the Ottoman Empire was vast, stretching from the Balkans to the Arabian Peninsula, from the Black Sea to North Africa. Its territories encompassed some of the most productive agricultural land in the world, some of the most strategic trade routes, some of the most ancient and wealthy cities. Surely such an empire could manage its obligations. Surely the government would find a way. Surely the currency, despite its gradual decline, would stabilize eventually. These reassurances were repeated in coffee houses and counting rooms across the empire. They were believed by educated men, by experienced merchants, by people who had built successful businesses and who should have known better. They were wrong. The Ottoman lira had been declining in value for decades, but the decline was gradual enough that most people adjusted their expectations rather than their strategies. Prices rose, but so did nominal wages and property values. If you looked at your ledger books, you seemed to be getting richer, the numbers were bigger each year. It was possible to convince yourself that you were keeping pace, that your wealth was intact, that the growing numbers in your accounts represented real value that would be there when you needed it. This was the great illusion that trapped millions. They measured their wealth in a currency that was slowly dying, and they failed to notice until it was too late to do anything about it. The first family whose story illuminates the path to survival were the Zarifis, Greek Orthodox bankers based in Constantinople but with connections stretching across the Mediterranean world, from Athens to Marseilles, from Venice to Alexandria. Georgios Zarifis, the patriarch of the family during this critical period, had built his fortune financing trade between the Ottoman Empire and Europe. Ships loaded with Ottoman grain, tobacco, and silk sailed to European ports on credit he provided. European manufactured goods returned on the same terms. He understood currencies the way a sailor understands the sea, not as an abstraction or a number but as a living force with moods and patterns and hidden currents that could be read by those who paid careful attention. Zarifis had watched the Ottoman government's borrowing with growing alarm throughout the 1870s. Each new loan from European banks was celebrated in Constantinople as a sign of the empire's creditworthiness, its acceptance by the modern financial world, its place among the great powers. Government ministers held receptions. Newspapers printed optimistic editorials. The empire, they said, was modernizing, joining the concert of civilized nations. Zarifis saw something different. He saw an empire mortgaging its future to pay for its present. He saw interest payments consuming an ever larger share of government revenues, leaving less and less for actual governance. He saw the mathematical certainty of eventual default, as clear and inevitable as the sunrise. Beginning in 1875, a full 6 years before the official bankruptcy, Zarifis began systematically converting his Ottoman holdings into foreign assets. He did this quietly, without fanfare, without alarming pronouncements, maintaining his presence and business operations in Constantinople while steadily moving his wealth elsewhere. He purchased property in Athens, in the newly independent Greek kingdom that had emerged from Ottoman rule decades earlier. He acquired shares in French and British trading companies whose values would not depend on Ottoman stability. He opened accounts in Swiss banks, those discreet institutions that asked few questions, kept excellent records, and had maintained their neutrality and stability through all the upheavals of European history. Most importantly, he converted a significant portion of his liquid wealth into gold, not Ottoman gold coins, whose value was tied to the empire's uncertain fortunes, but European gold coins and bullion that would hold their value regardless of what happened in Constantinople or anywhere else. His relatives and business partners thought him overly cautious, perhaps even foolish. Why move money out of the empire when there were such excellent opportunities at home? Why pay the costs and complications of foreign investment when Ottoman bonds paid such attractive interest rates? Why hold gold that earned nothing when interest-bearing investments were readily available? Zarifis answered these objections with a question of his own: what happens if the empire cannot pay those bonds? His partners had no answer, because they could not imagine such a thing happening. The empire had always paid its debts, one way or another. It was inconceivable that it would simply stop. Zarifis could imagine it, because he looked at the numbers rather than the assumptions. And because he could imagine it, he prepared for it. When the collapse came in 1881, Zarifis watched from a position of safety. His Constantinople operations suffered, certainly. The banking business could not escape the general crisis entirely, as credit froze and trade declined. But his core wealth, the family's true fortune, was untouched, held in assets that European creditors could not seize and denominated in currencies that European governments would not debase. While other bankers scrambled to salvage what they could from the wreckage, negotiating desperately with creditors and selling assets at ruinous prices, Zarifis had the luxury of patience. He could wait for the crisis to reach its bottom, for the last wave of panic selling to exhaust itself, and then, with his foreign-held capital, he could return to buy assets at prices that reflected desperation rather than value. In the years following the bankruptcy, Zarifis and his family acquired properties, businesses, and financial instruments at fractions of their pre-crisis values. Merchants who had mocked his caution now came to him begging for loans, willing to accept almost any terms. Properties that he had admired for years but found overpriced suddenly became affordable: mansions on the Bosphorus, productive estates in the countryside, established businesses with loyal customers. The crisis that destroyed others became his opportunity, but only because he had prepared for it years in advance, enduring the criticism and the opportunity cost that preparation required. The lesson of the Zarifis family is deceptively simple but profoundly difficult to execute in practice: diversification across political boundaries, not just asset classes. Most Ottoman investors understood the importance of owning different types of assets: property, business interests, government bonds, gold and silver. What they failed to understand was that all these assets, held within the same political and monetary system, were vulnerable to the same systemic risk. When the Ottoman system collapsed, it took all Ottoman-denominated assets with it, regardless of their type or quality. Only assets held outside the system, beyond the reach of Ottoman currency debasement and government desperation, retained their value. This is a lesson that modern investors often forget or never learn. Diversification within a single national market provides protection against individual company failures or sector downturns. It provides no protection whatsoever against currency collapse, government default, or systemic financial crisis. True protection requires assets held in multiple jurisdictions, denominated in multiple currencies, beyond the reach of any single government's desperation. This is more complicated than buying a variety of stocks, but it is the only genuine protection against the kind of catastrophe that periodically destroys fortunes throughout history. The second family whose strategies deserve careful study were the Commandos, a Sephardic Jewish banking dynasty whose origins traced back to Spain before the expulsion of 1492, through Venice, and finally to Constantinople, where they had risen to the heights of Ottoman finance. Abraham Salomon Commando, the family leader during the critical period, was known throughout the empire for his philanthropy, his cultural refinement, and his extraordinary financial acumen. He built hospitals for the poor, funded schools for Jewish communities, and collected art that would eventually grace the finest museums in Europe. But his true genius lay in understanding something that most financiers miss: the inseparable relationship between politics and money. Commando recognized something that many wealthy Ottomans missed entirely: the bankruptcy of 1881 would not be a purely economic event but a fundamental political transformation. European creditors would not simply demand repayment, they would demand control. The Ottoman public debt administration that emerged from the crisis was not merely a collection agency pursuing outstanding debts. It was a parallel government, one that controlled crucial revenue streams, employed its own officials, and answered to foreign rather than Ottoman interests. In this new political reality, those with connections to European power would thrive and prosper, while those without such connections would be marginalized regardless of their wealth or ability. Years before the crisis, Commando began cultivating relationships with European financial institutions, governments, and social elites with a deliberateness that revealed his understanding of what was coming. He sent his sons to be educated in Paris and London, ensuring they spoke French and English as well as they spoke Turkish and Ladino. He invested in European businesses not primarily for their financial returns, which were often modest, but for the relationships they created, the doors they opened, the networks they built. He became a bridge between Ottoman and European worlds, understanding both, trusted by both, invaluable to both and therefore protected by both. When the bankruptcy came and European administrators arrived to take control of Ottoman finances, the Commando family was positioned as essential intermediaries. They understood Ottoman business culture in ways that European creditors never could. They knew the unwritten rules, the social obligations, the religious considerations that affected commerce. They knew which officials could be trusted, which merchants were creditworthy, which investments were sound and which were speculation disguised as opportunity. The Europeans needed this knowledge desperately, and the Commandos provided it, for a price. Rather than being victims of the foreign takeover, swept away with other Ottoman fortunes, they became its beneficiaries, earning substantial fees and commissions as advisors to the new financial order. But Commando's foresight extended beyond mere political positioning. He also understood that the crisis would create a fundamental shift in which assets retained value and which would prove worthless. Government bonds, once considered the safest of investments, had proven worthless overnight. Currency holdings had evaporated as if they had never existed. But certain assets, particularly productive agricultural land and established businesses with tangible outputs, retained value even in the worst of the crisis. A farm still produced grain that people needed to eat. A textile workshop still produced cloth that people needed to wear. These goods had value that no bankruptcy decree could erase, no currency debasement could destroy. In the years before the crisis, Commando systematically shifted family wealth from financial instruments to productive assets. He acquired agricultural estates in Anatolia and Thrace, fertile lands that would produce value regardless of what happened to the currency in which that value was measured. He invested in manufacturing concerns that produced goods for export, ensuring revenue streams denominated in foreign currencies that the Ottoman government could not manipulate. He reduced the family's exposure to Ottoman government debt to nearly zero, despite the attractive interest rates such debt offered and despite the conventional wisdom that government bonds were safe investments. When the crisis struck, the Commando family's agricultural holdings continued to produce crops that could be sold for real value, for gold or foreign currency or barter if necessary. Their manufacturing investments continued to operate, selling goods to European markets for payment in sound currency. The Ottoman bonds that had ruined so many other wealthy families, that had seemed such prudent investments, were simply absent from their portfolio. They had traded the illusion of high returns for the reality of preserved capital, and when the illusion dissolved, only the reality remained. The lesson of the Commando family extends beyond mere investment strategy to encompass a broader understanding of what wealth truly means. They recognize that true wealth is not numbers in a ledger or balances in an account, but relationships, productive capacity, and political positioning. When the system that maintained those ledger numbers collapsed, when the accounts were revealed to be worthless, only those whose wealth existed in more fundamental forms survived to prosper. The third family whose story illuminates the path through economic catastrophe were the Baltazes, a Greek merchant family who had risen to prominence through the horse trade and agricultural investments. Their approach to the crisis was perhaps the most instructive of all because it was the most psychologically demanding, requiring not just intelligence but extraordinary emotional discipline. While the Zarifis family moved wealth abroad and the commandos cultivated political relationships, the Baltazes practiced what might be called strategic liquidity, the discipline of holding substantial resources in forms that could be deployed quickly when opportunity emerged from crisis. Aristotle Baltazzi, the family's leading figure during this period, was famous throughout Constantinople for his horse breeding operation, which produced some of the finest Arabian horses in the empire, sought after by wealthy buyers from Istanbul to Vienna. But horses were only the visible, public portion of his wealth. Less known, discussed only within the family, was his practice of maintaining large reserves of gold and silver, not invested in any enterprise, simply held in secure locations against future need. This practice puzzled his contemporaries greatly. Why let capital sit idle when it could be earning returns? Why hold inert metal when interest-bearing investments were available everywhere? Why waste the potential of money by refusing to put it to work? Baltazzi's answer revealed a sophistication that few of his critics possessed. Liquidity itself has value, and that value increases dramatically in times of crisis. When everyone else is desperate for cash, when credit has frozen and banks have failed, when assets cannot be sold at any reasonable price, the person holding cash has extraordinary power, power to buy, power to lend, power to dictate terms. The years before 1881 tested Baltazzi's patience severely. As other investors earned substantial returns on Ottoman bonds and urban real estate, as their ledgers showed growing profits and their lifestyles expanded accordingly, his gold sat inert in its hiding places, earning nothing, doing nothing, apparently wasted. Younger members of his family urged him repeatedly to put the capital to work, to stop this foolish hoarding, to join in the prosperity that everyone else was enjoying. Business associates suggested openly that he was becoming old and timid, that his best years were behind him. But Baltazzi held firm against all criticism, all pressure, all temptation, waiting for the moment when his patience would be rewarded. That moment came with the bankruptcy declaration. As panic spread through the Ottoman economy, as the reality of default sank in, asset prices collapsed across the board in the greatest financial destruction the empire had ever seen. Properties that had sold for thousands of liras were suddenly available for hundreds, if buyers could be found at any price. Businesses that had been beyond the reach of all but the wealthiest buyers suddenly found no buyers at all. Credit froze completely. Banks failed one after another. The economy ground to a halt as no one trusted anyone else, as no one knew what anything was worth, as the future became completely uncertain. In this environment of fear and paralysis, Baltazzi's gold became extraordinarily valuable, not merely for what it could buy, but for its very existence as a stable store of value in a world where nothing else was stable. He could buy when no one else could buy, because no one else had the means. He could provide capital to desperate merchants in exchange for shares of their businesses, shares they would never have sold in normal times at any price. He could acquire properties at prices that would never be seen again, prices that reflected only the desperation of sellers and the absence of any other buyers. Over the course of 2 years following the crisis, Baltazzi deployed his reserves in a systematic acquisition campaign that expanded the family's holdings dramatically. He bought estates, businesses, urban properties, and stakes in trading companies, paying a fraction of what they had cost their previous owners. When the crisis eventually passed and normal commerce resumed, he owned assets worth many times what he had paid for them. His years of patience, his endurance of criticism, his willingness to hold apparently unproductive reserves, all of it had been vindicated beyond anything he might have hoped. The Baltazzi approach required something that few investors possess: the emotional discipline to watch others profit while you wait, to appear foolish while others appear wise, to sit on the sidelines while the game is being played. For years before the crisis, those who had criticized Baltazzi's conservatism seemed to be proven right by events. Their investments grew while his sat dormant. They built new houses, bought new carriages, expanded their businesses, while he merely maintained what he had. Human psychology makes this experience extremely difficult to endure. The fear of missing out, the embarrassment of appearing foolish, the constant second-guessing of one's own judgment, the pressure from family and colleagues, these emotional forces cause most investors to abandon conservative strategies precisely when those strategies are about to pay off. Baltazzi understood something that most people never grasp: the greatest opportunities in financial markets come not during normal times but during crises, and the only way to exploit those opportunities is to have capital available when others do not. This required not just financial planning but psychological preparation, the cultivation of emotional discipline, the ability to endure years of apparent underperformance in anticipation of a moment that might or might not come. He prepared for a crisis that he believed was coming but could not predict with certainty. He paid the cost of that preparation willingly. And when the moment came, he was ready. When we examine these three families together, we see three distinct but complementary strategies for surviving economic catastrophe. The Zarifis' approach emphasized geographic diversification, spreading wealth across political boundaries so that no single government's failure could destroy everything. The Commando approach emphasized political positioning and productive assets, cultivating relationships with power while investing in things that produced real value regardless of currency fluctuations. The Baltazzi approach emphasized liquidity and patience, holding reserves that could be deployed when crisis created opportunity. What united all three families was something more fundamental than any specific strategy: they saw reality clearly while others saw what they wished to see. The Ottoman collapse of 1881 was not truly a surprise to anyone who looked honestly at the situation. The warning signs had been visible for years: the mounting debts that could never be repaid, the steady debasement of currency that eroded savings, the government's obvious inability to balance its accounts. Anyone who looked honestly at the situation could see that it was unsustainable, that something would eventually give way. But most people chose not to look honestly. They chose to believe the reassurances of officials who had every incentive to lie. They chose to continue as before because changing course was difficult and frightening and would require admitting that they had been wrong. They chose optimism over prudence, hope over preparation, and they paid for that choice with everything they had. The three families who survived had no special access to information. They read the same newspapers, attended the same social functions, heard the same official pronouncements, dealt with the same government officials as everyone else. Their advantage was entirely in their willingness to act on what they saw, even when action required sacrifice and endured criticism. They were willing to forego returns in the short term to ensure survival in the long term. They were willing to appear foolish in the eyes of others if that apparent foolishness proved to be wisdom when the crisis arrived. They were willing to be wrong in their timing, to prepare too early, to pay the cost of preparation for years, in order to be ready when the moment finally came. This psychological dimension of wealth preservation is perhaps the most important lesson these families offer. Financial strategies can be copied, but the emotional discipline to execute them consistently over years of apparent underperformance is rare. The ability to watch others prosper while you prepare for disaster, to endure mockery while maintaining your course, to resist the constant temptation to join the crowd, this requires a particular kind of character, a combination of intellectual clarity, emotional stability, and moral courage that few possess. It cannot be taught in the way that investment strategies can be taught. It must be cultivated through practice, through the deliberate development of the capacity to think independently and act accordingly. As we consider these historical lessons, we must also consider their application to our present circumstances. The parallels between the Ottoman situation in the 1870s and the global financial situation today are uncomfortable but undeniable to anyone willing to see them. Major economies carry debt burdens that seem mathematically unpayable by any conventional means. Currencies are created in quantities that would have seemed fantastical, even insane, a generation ago. Governments issue reassurances while the fundamental problems grow worse with each passing year. And most people, like the Ottoman merchants of 1875, continue as before, trusting that somehow things will work out, that someone will solve the problems, that the system will endure as it always has. The strategies of the Zarifis, Commando, and Baltazzi families are as applicable today as they were a century and a half ago. Geographic diversification, holding assets in multiple jurisdictions beyond the reach of any single government, remains a fundamental principle of wealth preservation. Productive assets, investments that generate real goods and services rather than mere financial returns, retain value when paper assets become worthless. Liquidity, the discipline of holding reserves that can be deployed when others are desperate, creates opportunities that only exist during crises. But the execution of these strategies today faces new challenges that these Ottoman families did not confront. Governments have become far more sophisticated in tracking and controlling wealth. Capital controls can be imposed at short notice, trapping wealth within national borders. International agreements allow governments to share information about their citizens' foreign holdings, eliminating the privacy that once protected assets abroad. The ease of moving wealth across borders that the Zarifis family enjoyed is no longer available to ordinary people without careful planning and professional assistance. Nevertheless, the principles remain sound even if the tactics must adapt. The fundamental insight, that wealth must be protected not just from ordinary market fluctuations but from systemic collapse, is eternal. The recognition that governments in financial distress will seek to solve their problems at the expense of their citizens is as old as government itself. The understanding that true wealth preservation requires action taken years before a crisis becomes apparent is the common thread that connects all successful examples throughout history. The Ottoman families who survived the 1881 bankruptcy were not prophets. They did not know exactly when the crisis would come or precisely what form it would take. What they knew was that a crisis was coming, that the situation was unsustainable and that sustainability, in financial matters, eventually asserts itself regardless of wishes or hopes. They prepared for a range of scenarios rather than predicting a single outcome. They accepted the cost of preparation as insurance rather than resenting it as waste. They understood that being too early is uncomfortable, but being too late is catastrophic. This mindset, the insurance mentality rather than the prediction mentality, is perhaps the most valuable inheritance these families left us across the centuries. We do not need to know exactly what form the next crisis will take or exactly when it will arrive. We do not need to time the market or predict turning points with precision. We need only recognize that systems built on unsustainable foundations eventually fail, and that those who prepare for failure survive while those who assume perpetual stability do not. The story of these three Ottoman families ends not with 1881 but with what came after, with the generations that followed. The Zarifis' descendants became prominent in Greek banking and business, their wealth having survived the Ottoman collapse intact, forming the foundation for continued prosperity in a new national context. The Commando family eventually relocated to Paris, where their art collection became the Musée Nissim de Commando, one of the finest private museums in France, a testament to wealth preserved through catastrophe. The Baltazzi descendants remained prominent in Greek and European society for generations, their crisis-era acquisitions forming the foundation of ongoing prosperity that would have been impossible had Aristotle Baltazzi followed the crowd. In each case, the wealth preserved through the 1881 crisis became the seed of continuing family success for generations. The strategies that seemed overly cautious, even foolish, in the 1870s were revealed as profound wisdom by the 1880s and beyond. The sacrifices made before the crisis, the returns foregone, the criticism endured, the discipline maintained, paid dividends for generations after. This is the nature of true wealth preservation. It is measured not in years but in generations, not in immediate returns but in lasting security that persists through whatever history might bring. As you reflect on what these families can teach us, consider your own situation with the same clarity they brought to theirs. Are you measuring your wealth in a currency that may not hold its value when tested by crisis? Are your assets concentrated in a single jurisdiction whose government is accumulating unsustainable debts? Do you have liquidity that could be deployed if crisis creates opportunity, or would you be forced to sell at the worst possible moment? Are you cultivating relationships and investing in productive assets that retain value regardless of what happens to financial markets and paper currencies? These are uncomfortable questions, and honest answers may require uncomfortable actions. But discomfort today is infinitely preferable to catastrophe tomorrow. The Ottoman merchants who lost everything in 1881 would have gladly endured the discomfort of preparation, would have gladly suffered the criticism of their peers, would have gladly foregone the returns of the boom years, if they could have their fortunes back. They cannot reclaim what was lost. But we can learn from their failure as surely as we can learn from the success of those who saw clearly and acted accordingly. If the story of these three families has prompted you to think differently about your own preparations, about your own vulnerability to the kind of systemic crisis that periodically reshapes the world, I would genuinely like to hear your thoughts. What strategies are you considering? What obstacles do you face in implementing them? What have you learned from your own experience or study? These conversations matter, because the lessons of history only have value when they're applied to the present, when they inform action rather than merely entertaining curiosity. And if this exploration of the past has given you insights for the future, consider sharing it with others who might benefit from understanding these patterns. The more people who understand how wealth is truly preserved through crisis, the more who might survive when patterns repeat themselves, as they always do. For those who want to continue exploring how history illuminates our present moment, revealing the patterns that most people never see, you know how to stay connected. These stories matter more than ever, and there are many more to tell.